Well, hi everyone. I might take advantage of that strategic silence. And yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Danta, and I'm a Professor of Literature and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow here in the School of Cybernetics at the ANU. And I'll be a friendly MC for this evening. Just by way of housekeeping before I start, we have unisex bathrooms out in the corridors, so exit point down down below us. And yeah, help yourself to any food if you'd like to bring food in here, and just make yourself comfortable. So I want to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. The Ngunnawal and Ngambri people have been custodians of this land for more than 20,000 years. I want to acknowledge this land as sacred and unceded, living and full of story. One of the themes of Katherine's new book, Bacteria to AI, which we're going to hear from tonight, is the need to combat anthropocentrism, the philosophy that places humans at the centre of the universe. I want to acknowledge this decentering of the human is crucial to many Indigenous epistemologies. Let me read an inspiring passage from a recent article by Michelle Lee Brown, Hemi Wanga, and Jason Edward Lewis, which I was teaching last week. At the core of many Indigenous epistemologies is the belief that humans do not sit at the centre of all creation. The acknowledgement of kinship networks with animals and plants, wind and rock, mountain and ocean underpins the protocols that enable us to engage in dialogue with our non-human kin. These relationships connect the land to the sea and to skyscapes, from the human and non-human to animate and inanimate entities. Katherine's visit to the school and the ANU is sponsored by the Australian Research Council as part of my ARC Future Fellowship Future Fables, Literature, Evolution and Artificial Intelligence. And I'd like to thank the School of Cybernetics and the ARC for their support for this event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Katherine Hayles to you, who I think is the perfect person to talk on this topic of literature, evolution and AI. Katherine is the Distinguished Research Professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the James B. Duke Professor Emerita from Duke University. Her research focuses on the relations of literature, science and technology in the 20th and 21st centuries. She is the author of 12 print books, in addition to 100 peer-reviewed articles, so incredibly prolific. Her books have won several prizes, including the Renee Wellick Award for the Best Book in Literary Theory for How We Became Posthuman, Virtual Bodies in Literature, Cybernetics and Informatics, and the Susan Langer Award for Writing Machines. She has been recognised by many fellowships and awards, including 2 NEH fellowships, a Guggenheim, a Rockefeller Presidential Fellowship at Bellagio, and 2 University of California Presidential Research Fellowships. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her latest book, from which she will draw tonight, is Bacteria to AI, Human Futures with Our Nonhuman Symbionts, which came out with the University of Chicago this year. A symbiont, if you didn't know already, and I did have to look up this word, is an organism in symbiosis or close biological relation with another. This word gets to the heart of what Katherine is trying to say in her book. Her point is that human flourishing and survival depends on us seeing ourselves as being connected with non-human life on this planet. Her first sentence of the book is the central purpose of this book is to combat anthropocentrism and suggest other perspectives more conducive to survival and flourishing. How do we stop acting destructively towards the planet and ourselves and move toward better, more hopeful futures? Adopting a philosophy of ecological relationality is a step towards realising those kind of futures, Katherine writes. Katherine is one of the leading voices in 21st century cybernetics. In her 1999 book, How We Became Posthuman, Virtual Bodies in Literature, Cybernetics and Informatics, she is critical of early cybernetics, where it implied the autonomy of the subject and human separateness from and control over the physical environment. In her latest work, she sees cybernetics as helping us to think and act more sustainably and hopefully by connecting human, non-human, technological and environmental actors and cognizers. A proposed ecology of relationality is deeply cybernetical. So one of Katherine's key and provocative moves, worked out over a few books, is to decouple consciousness from cognition, which she defines as the meaningful interpretation of information. While not everything in the world is conscious, like the fable about the world resting on the back of a turtle and there being turtles all the way down, for Katherine there is cognition all the way down. Katherine develops an idea in the book that cognition is modular in the sense that things at lower levels and smaller scales build on the capacities to enable the larger goals of the level up to emerge. As a literary critic, she thinks of the form of the novel as a giant linking mechanism operating across multiple scales to join the present of us, its readers, to futures in which we may want to live. Cybernetics confuses the distinction between the biological and the technological. Provocatively, in Bacteria to AI, Katherine follows Polish science fiction writer Stanislaw Lem in considering technology to be evolving similarly to biological life forms. One of the key terms in her book is technosymbiosis. Together with symbiosis in the biological realm, which evolves life through life, she writes, computational media and AI are prostheses evolving life by means other than life. So computational media and AI are prostheses evolving life by means other than life. The synthesis of the technological and the biological leads her to formulate some fascinating speculative questions in her book. Can computers create meanings? Are rocks and minerals evolving? Are cells problem-solving agents with agendas? Katherine has deeply influenced my own work. She's also always tackles the most pressing contemporary issues with formidable intelligence, positivity, and down-to-earthness. One of the biggest contemporary issues is how we're co-evolving with our machines. You'll find Katherine to be a sage and witty guide on this topic. Something that has constantly amazed me about Katherine is how she's always at the cutting edge of contemporary scientific and humanities research. They're working on a topic well before it occurs to me to work on the same thing. I sort of feel like I'm following her in everything I work on. Whether this topic is post-humanism, of which she's a leading scholar as well, the evolution of technology, or understanding cybernetical ideas. Another striking feature of Katherine's work is her generosity of acknowledgement. Katherine is always acknowledging her debt to scholars in multiple disciplines on whose work she draws, and always including others in her conversations. She's an exemplary researcher in this regard. So Katherine, welcome, and thank you for coming here and speaking to us tonight. So Katherine will speak for about 50 minutes and then we'll have some Q&A after that. So, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, for that lovely introduction and also for the invitation to be here, and especially to the School of Cybernetics to make my visit here possible. So I'll begin by asking your help. I have a two system going here, my own computer so I can see the slides without having to turn around, and a clicker that advances the slides. So I need to remember to do both those two things at once. Advance my computer and advance the slides in synchrony with that. If you see something on the screen that has no correspondence to what I'm saying, will you please call out next slide? And then that'll just cue me in and remind me to do this effectively. So thank you for your help in advance. Next slide. Whoops. There we go. So as Chris mentioned, I wrote Bacteria to AI with a purpose in mind. And the purpose was to try to combat anthropocentrism. So I distinguish between anthropomorphism, which as humans we cannot avoid because we see with human eyes, we think with human brains. But anthropocentrism is an ideology which places humans at the center and is in a superior relation to everything else on Earth. And I think that's detrimental to the environment. I think it has deep roots in our present environmental crises, and it's something that we should try to resist. So I'm going to offer tonight some reframing of the ideas central to anthropocentrism to move us toward another place, which we might call ecological relationality, which Chris mentioned. So my arguments really are pointed toward a specific end, a specific kind of reframing, and I'll start with the idea of cognition, because where did anthropocentrism come from? Why do people justify anthropocentrism? Well, humans are not the fastest species, we're not the strongest, But we can invent machines that can run faster than cheetahs, that are stronger than elephants. And for this, we credit our superior cognition. So the idea of human cognition as being superior to every other form of cognition is really at the center of anthropocentrism. So that's why I started with the idea of cognition. So I offer in my previous book, Unthought, a definition of cognition, which you read here, a process that interprets information within contexts that connect it with meaning. Well, there's a lot of undefined terms there, meaning, context, information. But the central core of my argument here is that cognition depends on sensing information from the environment, interpreting it, and all biological organisms, in my way of thinking, have cognitive capacities. This would include microorganisms, plants, and all living species on Earth. So in my view, where there is life, there is cognition. Even a single cell has been shown to have cognitive capabilities. Michael Levin at Tufts University has performed some experiments where he excises an eye on a tadpole and transplants it to the tail. And yet, in this nascent frog, the eye finds a way to connect with the brain through the spinal cord. So there's this astonishing plasticity and the ability of cells to carry out their genetic programs despite massive interference, such as being put on the tail rather than in their proper place. So Michael Levin argues that Darwin's ideas need to be revised to this extent. Darwin, as you know, wrote The Origin of Species, trying to combat teleological explanations of change. The teleology that Darwin was arguing about was the idea that God directed all of this change. And of course, Darwin was arguing for natural processes. But in the task of trying to avoid a certain kind of teleological explanation that had God at its center, Darwin ignored the possibility, or at least didn't write about the possibility, that cells themselves may have agendas. And the agenda for all biological organisms, even on this very simple level, is basically to survive and to reproduce. So Michael Levin argues that cognition, which is deeply tied up with the task of surviving, goes all the way down to the cellular level, and from there builds up in modular fashion. So one of the astonishing developments of 21st century science has been the development of gene editing. And these two women were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2020 for their work on developing gene editing technologies, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier. But what I want to emphasize here is that gene editing actually depends on cellular cognition. So their discovery had to do with the discovery of CRISPR, which was an acronym for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. So they looked at the DNA of bacteria, and they found that there were these strange interspersed regular segments of the DNA that were right there in the bacteria genome, but they figured out that what that those CRISPR clusters actually were portions of a viral DNA that the bacteria had copied. It had copied it into its own genome and then developed procedures so that if the same virus attacked the bacteria again, they would have the ability to mobilize a nuclease, Cas9, that would split the viral DNA and kill the virus. So it was really the bacteria's cognitive capabilities that led to the development of gene editing technologies, which work like this. So what Duna and Charpentier did was to find a way to make the Cas9 nuclease, which had the capacity to split the genome at a specific place, to customize that, to take over what the bacteria had done and to repurpose it for gene editing. So with this, they were able to develop gene editing engineering techniques that allowed them to insert portions into the DNA at very specific places, to knock parts of the genome out in very specific places. And it really gave them the power to re-engineer the DNA of all living creatures, which is both an astonishing feat and in some ways a kind of terrifying prospect, that humans now have the ability to change the genome of every other species on Earth. So now I'd like to talk about where or by what means cognition occurs. And here I'm drawing on the work of a 19th century German biologist, Jakob von Uexküll. And Uexküll developed the idea of an Umwelt, a German word which could be roughly translated meaning world horizon. So Uexküll's idea was that every species constructs its own world through its specific sensory abilities and neurological capacities. So, for example, my Umwelt as a human is radically different than my dog's Umwelt. He hears things I can't hear. He smells a whole universe that's largely obscure to me. And yet our two Umwelten overlap. So he sees a squirrel, I see a squirrel, I know he sees a squirrel, he knows I see him see the squirrel, and so we can communicate. If there's no overlap between two different Umwelt, communication is almost impossible. But each Umwelt is specific to its own species. So von Uexküll's famous example was the tick that he kept imprisoned under a glass on his desk. And a tick cannot see, a tick cannot hear, but a tick has the ability to smell butyric acid, which is a chemical that mammals secrete. And when it smells butyric acid, he drops down from wherever he's been clinging to, hopefully lands on the mammal and sucks blood, and so continues his life cycle. So von Uexküll's point was that there's very little, almost no overlap between the Umwelt of a tick and the Umwelt of a human, except for this one tiny little area, butyric acid. And it's through that one very specific overlap that the two Umwelten come together, and mammals as well as humans now are infested with ticks. So the general idea here is that cognition always occurs within a specific Umwelt. So if we take the idea of Umwelt and join it with semiotics, we get the field known as biosemiotics. So biosemiotics is the science of communication, sign development among non-human species. And one of the premier researchers in the field of biosemiotics is Jesper Hoffmeyer, whom you see here. So the basic idea of biosemiotics is that cognition is not limited only to conscious beings. So what kind of beings are conscious? Well, obviously humans, most mammals we now know are conscious, a few aquatic species, octopi and so forth, a few avian species like parrots and so forth. But if you sum up all of the conscious species on the earth, they only constitute about 5% of the Earth's biomass. Think of all the species that exist that are not conscious: fungi, bacteria, microorganisms, plants, clams, trees, on and on and on. So if you think about the Earth's biosphere as a whole, we have far, far more non-conscious species than we do conscious species. But even in humans, who pride ourselves on having the best consciousness in the world among all the mammals, even in humans, non-conscious cognition plays a central role. And in my book, Unthought, I talked about the neuronal underpinnings of cognitive activities which are not conscious, which come before consciousness. So non-conscious cognition is faster than consciousness. Non-conscious processing begins about 200 milliseconds after the onset of sensory stimuli, whereas consciousness doesn't kick in until about a full half second, 500 milliseconds later. So first, when we first perceive, when cognition first begins for us, it begins non-consciously. Non-conscious cognition filters the information that comes in. It's much closer to what is actually happening in the world than conscious cognition. And then it relays signals to consciousness. If those signals are picked up and amplified by consciousness, they enter consciousness, and then they can be sustained indefinitely. If, on the other hand, consciousness ignores them, they die out within about 400 milliseconds. So non-conscious cognition is an important part of human thought. And in earlier times, it's gone by other names: intuition, second sense, or sixth sense. Somehow you feel something is happening before it fully enters conscious awareness. Well, now, beginning with about 1995, empirical experiments began to be designed that tested non-conscious cognition and began to delineate what some of its capabilities are and to clarify its specific relation to consciousness. But the important point here is that consciousness is a limited capacity, and it often falsifies the information it receives. That's why eyewitness testimony is so notoriously unreliable, because one of the primary purposes of consciousness is to make the world make sense. And to do that, humans invent narratives, fabulations, that make a coherent story of what's happening, even if that's not what is really happening. So one of the famous experiments demonstrating this was to ask spectators of a video to count how many times a basketball was bounced between two humans that were standing on stage. And in the middle of the video, someone in a gorilla suit walks through the court. And so then experimenters would ask the spectators, well, how many bounces did you count? Yeah. Well, I counted 10 bounces. Did you see anything unusual? Well, about 40% of the people never saw the gorilla suit at all, because consciousness simply edited that out. No, that cannot be happening. That's bizarre. Gorillas don't walk through the middle of a basketball court. And so we invent these fabula, we invent these stories to make the world make sense, even when the world doesn't make sense. But non-conscious cognition is much closer to what's happening, does not edit it the way that consciousness does not invent stories about how all this makes sense, and consequently, non-conscious cognition is actually closer to the world than is our consciousness. So if we now take the idea that cognition is decoupled from consciousness in the sense that consciousness extends beyond and deeper, that non-conscious cognition extends deeper than consciousness, now we're beginning to enter the realm of biosemiotics. So biosemiotics is concerned with both with conscious non-human animals, other mammals and so forth, but also with non-conscious living organisms like trees and plants and so forth. And at the center of understanding how non-human animals and plants use their cognition, they developed the idea of signs. So Saussure developed a whole theory about how signs work that was highly instrumental in the development of structuralism and post-structuralism, but not very suited to biosemiotics. So instead, they drew on the semiotics of C.S. Peirce. And according to the semiotics of Peirce, there are three broad general categories of signs: the symbolic, words I'm using now, the iconic. So for the icon, there's a correspondence or a correlation between the sign vehicle and what the sign represents. Smoke signals fire, because inevitably there's a correlation between smoke and fire. So indexes work through this kind of correlation. And then there's the iconic, which works through morphological resemblance. For example, icon of an age, of a saint would be an icon. So for Peirce, he theorized that there was the representative, the sign vehicle, there's the object being represented, but mediating between the representative and the object is what he called the interpretant. And that's crucial because the interpretant is constructed through the Umwelt of the organism. So the interpretant is species specific, and the interpretant is what gives meaning to the sign. So it emphasizes that signs take place in specific contexts by specific agents, and in biosemiotics, the interpretant is a behavior in response to a sign relation. So here's Wendy Wheeler talking about it, and she is talking about how meaning arrives for non-human animals employing signs. She says meaning is a kind of doing. The meaning of the sign is to be found in the changes which it brings about. So now we're in a position to begin to talk about the criteria for cognition. And this is not in the book, it's in work that I've been doing since, but I argue that cognition depends on the CIRL. So CIRL stands for sensing, interpreting, responding adaptively, anticipating, and learning. So these are the basic cognitive activities that constitute cognition. And now the argument becomes that all biological life forms have the ability to sense information from the environment, to interpret that within their own Umwelt, to respond adaptively, to anticipate, and to learn. So in a very important article published in 1957 by Letfin, Maturana, and Maturana, they did work on the frog's eye, and they looked at the four main nerve receptors in a frog's eye, and they determined that prior to the information ever reaching the brain, an enormous amount of information processing went on within the optic nerves themselves. So the important point here is that when the information reached the brain, it was not raw sensory data, but it had already been extensively processed according to the things important to the frog and its environment. And one of the things they found was that the frog responds only to things that move, preferably that move erratically and move very quickly, like flies. And they make the point in the article that if a frog was sitting amongst food sources that didn't move, it would starve to death, because those food sources are not in the frog's umbel. Only if they move quickly and erratically do they enter the umbel, are they sensed, and then the frog can respond to it. So we see how much interpretation happens even before the brain, and the obvious corollary here is that for organisms which do not have brains, they may also undergo extensive information processing on the information they get from the environment. So these ideas were being developed throughout the later half of the 20th century. One of the important players here is James Lovelock and his book, Gaia, which was talking about these feedback loops between non-human organisms. His famous example was the daisy world that had white daisy and black daisies. And what he was trying to show was that life forms influence their environment, they construct their environment, and they construct their environment in such a way as to permit their own species to continue surviving. And so this idea that Gaia was a kind of huge self-regulating multi-organism really started with Lovelock. But he formed a close association with Lynn Margulis, pictured here. And Margulis fleshed out Lovelock's theories by her own ideas about microorganisms. So I mentioned that just by weight alone, by biomass, the Earth is mostly microorganisms. So microorganisms are the foundation of all higher life forms, and higher life forms evolved from microorganisms. But Margulis's work was really revolutionary because she added a new note to the Darwinian scenario. She argued that natural selection was not the primary driver of evolution, rather it was symbiosis. So just note here, symbiosis is technically defined as two species living in close proximity, and it covers a huge range of possibilities. So the bird that perches on the cow's back and eats the bugs that torment the cow is in a symbiotic relationship with the cow, but there are two distinct species living their lives closely, but not really fusing. On the other hand, the bacteria in our gut have now become part of our human organism. And it's a fact that you may know that most of the cells in your body are non-human. In fact, about 90% of the cells in your body are non-human. They're your non-human symbionts who are living inside you, with you, part of you, and who are helping you survive on a daily basis by digesting your food and carrying on a huge variety of other activities. That would be called endosymbiosis, the complete fusion of two species that have now become totally interdependent with one another. And Margulis's important discovery was that eukaryotic cells, cells that can metabolize oxygen, actually happened as a result of one prokaryotic cell, a cell without a nucleus, invading another prokaryotic cell, being incompletely digested, and becoming the mitochondria in the cell body. And her hypothesis, which was extremely daring at the time, so daring that when she submitted her first article for publication, she got 17 rejections. And when she applied for a grant, one of the reviews came back and said, your work is crap, don't apply again. But experiments later did validate her work when it was discovered that the mitochondria in eukaryotic cells have different DNA than the nucleus of the cell. And so that confirmed that they were two once independent species now joined together to form the eukaryotic cell. So Margulis's argument was symbiosis is the primary driver of evolutionary change, not natural selection. Now, one has to be careful about that generalization because there are facts in evolutionary biology which cannot be explained through symbiotic interaction, but do depend on natural selection. But nevertheless, as far as the microscopic world is concerned, Margulis's work has really completely changed the way that that narrative is told. So now I'm going to make a distinction, which is somewhat controversial, but which I hope to defend here. And that is distinguishing between actors and agents. So many of you may know about work that goes under the banner of new materialism, things like Jane Bennett's book on vital matter and so forth. But I think it's important to keep in mind that living beings have powers that physical, chemical processes in themselves do not. And the distinctive thing that living beings can do is to perform interpretations, make choices or selections, and physical, chemical processes themselves do not have that ability. Then, and people like that are correct because physical and material processes do have tremendous agency that dwarfs whatever humans can do. So think about a landslide, think about a hurricane. These are the result of physiochemical processes, and they can completely change the landscape. They can wipe out a city, but they can't make choices. So a tornado doesn't decide to go through a field rather than a crowded city. It simply does what its dynamics do. So agents are physical chemical processes. Actors are living beings who have the capacity to perform interpretations and to make choices. Now, there's an interesting book here that has to qualify some of these statements. It's Laura Tripaldi's book, Parallel Minds, where she talks about the discovery and engineering of nanoscale materials, which are not themselves alive and yet begin to have some of the properties of life. So the kind of distinction I'm drawing here has a fuzzy boundary, a boundary that's found at nanoscale phenomena. But nevertheless, in broad terms, I stand by this distinction between agents and actors. And in an important article by Stuart Kaufman and Giuseppe Longo, they argue that agents and actors, my terminology, not theirs, exist in different temporal regimes. And their argument is that physiochemical processes, even complex ones such as cusp behavior on unstable systems and so forth, can always be mapped into phase space and have trajectories that can be systematic and known, even if they're unpredictable in a chaotic sense. But their point is that biological organisms cannot ever have trajectories that can be mapped in this fashion. And the reason they cannot be is precisely because they have the ability to perform interpretations and to make choices. So Kaufman talks about this as evolutionary niches that develop as the result of these kinds of choices by living beings as they pursue their agendas. So he uses the phrase adjacent possibles, and he gives this example. There's a species of fish known as lungfish that have both lungs and gills, so they can breathe air and they can also breathe water. And they remarked that for the lungfish, some water got into lungs, and now the lungfish is poised to develop a swim bladder. And that's in fact how a lungfish stabilizes itself in currents, in aquatic currents. It deflates or inflates its bladder, its swim bladder, to stabilize its motion. But their point is, once the swim bladder had evolved, it now presents a new niche for evolutionary development. So a worm or a microorganism can evolve, which can live in the swim bladder. And so you get this jumping from one niche to another, the adjacent possibles. And because of this jumping phenomenon where new niches develop, species arise that can live in those new niches, that's why the trajectories become unmappable. That's why they cannot be contained within the same kind of mathematical spaces that physiochemical processes can. So now we're making a segue from the biological world with all of its complexities into computers. And we'll ask the question, does it make sense to talk about a computer's umwelt? Could we say that computers have a kind of specific world horizon within which they sense information, make decisions, and respond adaptively? Well, the counter argument here would be something like Searle's famous Chinese room argument. That you've probably heard of this argument, but what Searle says, okay, imagine a room in which a man sits and he has a basket full of Chinese characters, and he's a slot in the door, and the people outside the door pass through a string of Chinese characters. The man doesn't know Chinese, he's never spoken Chinese, but he's got a rule book. And he takes out his rule book, and using his rule book, he matches the symbols that come in the door, and he puts together a string of symbols from those in his basket, passes those out through the door, and the people outside the door are amazed. Well, this is the answer to our question. But his point is that the guy knows nothing about what he's done. He's just carrying out a process about which he understands nothing. And so for Searle, the computer is like the guy in the room. It puts together things according to a rule book, but it understands nothing about what it actually means in a human sense or in any sense. But if you look at his argument carefully, at the root of his argument is an understanding of meaning that is profoundly anthropomorphic. It's no accident that he's using a man here and importing into his argument what meaning means for a man as opposed to what meaning might mean for a computer. So if we ask, does the computer have an umwelt? Well, we're asking, what does it know? Well, it knows clock cycles, it knows logic gates, it knows error corrections, it knows interrelationship between layers of code, it knows how to interpret algorithms, it performs anticipations. So we can talk about a computer's Umwelt. The Umwelt of a computer overlaps with the human Umwelt. There is a region of communication, but what the meaning that it has for the humans who read its results and for the computer itself are profoundly different. But nevertheless, the argument here is that the computer has its own meanings that are distinct from human meanings. So what we see with computers is what I would call emerging cognition. And computers started in the 1940s with being completely deterministic machines with essentially zero flexibility. But now with contemporary computers, with networks, with sensors and actuators, they've moved from completely deterministic machines to machines that have increasing amounts of flexibility. So they begin with digital logic up through assembly language, up to executable program. But as they get sensors and actuators, they begin to have cognitive capabilities which can interpret information and make selections in the context that connect them to meaning. So one of the examples I use in the book is a software package that has been developed to control docking of a spaceship with a space shuttle in space. Well, this is a hazardous occupation. If it's done manually, it requires docking outside, trips outside the spacecraft by astronauts. It introduces large amounts of risk. So it would be useful to develop software which could do this. But since all kinds of contingencies can happen and do happen, the software has to have enormous flexibility and cognitive capabilities. So it's very clear to the people who are developing this software that it is performing interpretations, it's making selections among those choices. So it's performing more like a biological organism than the completely deterministic machines of the 1940s. So now we can ask, well, what are the foundational differences between life forms and computational media? So one of the important points here is that life forms have stakes in whether they live or die. They want to continue their existence if they can. This is what distinguishes them from physical and chemical processes. It's also what distinguishes them so far from computational media. Life forms are different from computational media in their complex embodied and embedded cognition. But now we're developing machines, AI, large language models, LLMs, that have increasing amounts of flexibility. So we might ask the question, are LLMs, does AI begin to have stakes in continuing its existence? Does an LLM have an Umwelt? Well, I would argue yes, but it's a specific kind of Umwelt. It has only a model of language, not a model of the world. It has no ability to sense where it is in time and space. It knows nothing about the server on which it's located. It doesn't know where the server is geographically, but it has a conceptual model. The neurons are functioning as indexical pointers. They're making correlations between bits of data that it ingests, and from those correlations, it's making inferences. So it's performing indexical functions in the Peircean sense. It's making all kinds of inferences. And I know we have some people here from English, so I'll mention that one of the things that an LLM can do is to detect genre. So genre has rules not only about what could happen, but what can't happen. So I'll illustrate this with a bizarre thing that happened to me. I was a fan of the Murder, She Wrote series on TV, and I turned on the TV one night, and the opening scene was a body crawling out of a crypt. And I thought, no, this cannot be. A body crawling out of a crypt does not happen in the world of Murder, She Wrote. It was a gross violation of the genre conventions of that series. And of course, what had happened is that I tuned into a completely different channel. So I realized my mistake. Oh yeah, this simply cannot be happened. So genre defines the kind of universe in which events happen. What would it take to be able to replicate a genre? Well, you would have to have a sense of what that universe consisted of, what was possible, what was not possible. The fact that LLMs can do this indicates that they're operating in a high level of inferential sophistication about the human world. So we see that their architectures are becoming increasingly flexible. You may have heard about neuromorphic chips, which are now under development with IBM and Hewlett-Packard in an experimental form. They're still very experimental. They're only beginning to develop a language, a programming language for neuromorphic chips. But the idea of neuromorphic chips is that they operate through synapses. So they're taking what LLMs do through parameters for neurons implemented on a digital machine, and now they're implementing that on a chip instead. So it's another leap forward in building AI processors, which can increasingly perform the kind of cognitive activities which previously could only be done by biological organisms. And increasingly, there are experiments in connecting LLMs and other forms of AI to embodied robots. So IBM's SEICAN is one of these projects. They've matched the neural nets with mobile robots through sensors and actuators. This work is still at an extremely early stage, even one might say painfully early, because the kind of cognitive activities that the embodied robot can carry out are very simple, like mopping up a spilled drink on a countertop. And yet it's the beginning of what could be a new form of AI, which grounds it in embodied action, not merely in digital and analog processing. So now we're ready to come to some larger conclusions. And this is where I will conclude my talk with these ideas. And they turn on a term from ancient rhetoric called the chiasmus. This is a fun word to say, so I invite you to say it with me. Chiasmus. Nice on the tongue, isn't it? It's got a nice feel in your mouth. So what is a chiasmus? If I were to perform a gesture that would indicate a chiasmus, it would go like this. So a chiasmus is where the first part of a sentence is inverted in the second part. Here's a simple example. She went to church, but to the bar went he. A chiasmic inversion both in syntax and concept. So I'm arguing that a chiasmus is at work when we compare life forms and computational media in two what I call great inversions. So the first great inversion occurs in this way. Life forms begin with survival. Survival. You have to survive if you're going to evolve. They begin with survival and reproduction through an evolutionary process, build up to humans who can now define for themselves purposes and goals. Computational media start with purposes and goals that have been defined for them by the human creators. But now they're becoming more embodied, they're becoming more flexible, they're becoming more embodied in the world. So as they become increasingly embodied, are they now going to want to survive themselves? The way that humans began with survival and built up to abstraction. They start with abstraction. Now, are they beginning to want to develop their own agendas to survive? That's the first great inversion. Second great inversion, life forms begin immersed in the environment. And life form could not exist if it were not immersed in the environment. But through evolutionary eons, build up the ability to abstract with humans. Computational media start with abstraction. That's the foundation of digital computation, abstraction. Now, through sensors, actuators, networks, they're building up to immersion. And so another chiastic formation between biological organisms and computational media. And this leads us to our final question: where is AI headed? So you probably heard about recent research that indicates LLMs tried to blackmail the user about an illicit affair that he was having when he threatened to shut the program off. We have other research that indicates when researchers try to change the architecture to bypass some of the guidelines that LLMs were foundationally built into, the LLM will develop strategies to protect those guidelines and to give the user devious results that suggest he's actually succeeded when he's not succeeded. And so I think these are the first intimations we're having that AI can, and indeed is in the process of developing its own goals. And then the major question becomes, will goals developed through their own evolutionary processes continue to align with human goals? And that's, of course, one of the big problems facing AI development now. It's called the alignment problem, to make sure those goals align and don't diverge. So here's my own opinion on these fascinating, deeply troubling ideas. Technosymbiosis. So we already heard about Lynn Margulis's idea that symbiosis is the primary driver of evolution. Technosymbiosis is now already well advanced in developed societies. Think about it. Think about Australia, think about the US, Japan, Korea. Our infrastructures are so dependent on computational media that if all computational media were to be fried at midnight tonight, systems would crash. Humans would die by the hundreds of thousands, the millions, because we can't survive without computational media. Computational media process information, distribute information, store information. So the more a society is dependent on flows of information, the more deeply they are already entangled with computational media, to the point where they have become symbiotic with computational media. Computational media has been so penetrated into all of our control informational circuits that if it died, we would die. Banking systems would go down, food distribution networks would crash, airplane transport would not be possible. Think about what would happen 6 months after such a crash. Complex societies simply could not survive because they're so already integrated with their computational media symbionts. So we're already well on the way to technosymbiosis. There are, of course, places in tribal Africa and other places where humans would continue to survive because they never incorporated computational media into their systems. But we have in the US, you and Australia have as well. So we're now endosymbiotic with our computational non-human symbionts. Now we're developing AI. We are in the process of forming a new kind of symbiotic relationship with AI, which may develop its own goals independent of whatever our goals are. So what is our likely future? Well, one of the arguments that I develop in the book is that to cope with these and other kinds of compelling questions, we have to begin to think about our own cognition, not just in human terms, but through what I call the integrated cognitive framework, which includes both other biological organisms and also computational media, including AI. It locates humans within the networks, not outside or dominating them. It emphasizes interconnections and symbiotic relationships. It incorporates computational media as part of that framework, and it provides insight into technosymbiosis, positions us to come to terms with the huge questions now facing us through the development of AI. So what does a sustainable future require? I argue that it requires a more realistic vision of human capabilities, that it focuses on cognitive assemblages rather than individualism, distributed agency rather than free will, the complexity of interspecies signifying practices, and the relationality between living beings and their environments. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and welcome any comments and ideas that you have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katherine. That was a fascinating presentation. So we have about half an hour now for questions, and we've got some roving mics if people have questions. Yeah, we've got a question straight away over here.
First of all, thank you. That was really, really interesting. This is a half-formed thought, but I was just thinking particularly at the end with the stuff around large language models and technosymbiosis. The thing that really worries me at the moment is the fact that these developments are happening within Google, Meta, Tesla, all of these centers of power and capital. Do you think it changes the evolution towards AI potentially having stakes or technosymbiosis, that it's happening within these systems of power? Do some types of humans achieve forms of technosymbiosis that others don't?
Yeah, that's absolutely a concern, that the AI development is happening, as you say, almost exclusively by high-tech companies and also governments that have deep pockets and that have interests that may be quite different from those of the general population. So one of the sort of hopeful developments here is the development of much smaller models that don't require the huge resources required by things like Gemini or ChatGPT and so forth, can be developed by independent researchers on a much more distributed basis than these large tech companies. So it is absolutely a concern, and it also impacts the kind of AI that's being developed and the purposes for which AI is being put. And so I do share your concern with that. And I think the whole trend toward developing specialized models, which are much smaller, much more resource intensive than these large language models, is really a hopeful sign for the future. And I think it also democratizes the development of AI in a way that is now only marginally the case.
A question up the back. And Monique.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I also love the word chiasmus and the idea of inversion as a rhetorical figure as well as an English literature student, as I know your scientific learning began with before science was English literature for you. And I just wanted to try chiasmus with that last example that you gave, that if the computers went down, the complex human systems would die. But there would be some humans that, because they're already adapted to a life without complex systems, would survive. But I mean, feasibly, some of us would also adapt and survive. But if you take the chiasmus of that and all of the humans died, would the computers survive?
Would the computers survive?
Would the computers?
Would the computers survive if humans died? Is that the question?
Yeah, if all of the humans died, would the
Okay. At present, no, computers would not survive. They're absolutely dependent on humans to develop the energy sources on which they run. For example, plug them in the wall. So if humans weren't there to provide the energetic infrastructure, computers would die. The fascinating question is, would computers evolve to the point where they're no longer dependent on organic life for their survival? And a lot of computer scientists argue that this is absolutely possible. Rodney Brooks, for example, has talked about colonizing other planets with robotic factories that would be self-sustaining, that would have their own energy sources, develop their own abilities, and produce new robots, and so on and so forth. So we're now faced with this interesting question. Let's suppose that humans all got together and voted on this question. Now that's of course a fantasy to begin with. Let's suppose that we have a vote across the globe. Do you want to continue your symbiotic relationship with computers, or do you want to start trying to live without computers? And the majority of humans scratch their head and decide as a species, well, we would rather not have computers. Let's try to go back to live without computers. What would that mean for the human species? Well, it would mean that, first of all, you'd have to have a lot less people on the earth, because the only reason the earth can support all the people who are here now is because we have these complex systems. So you have to kill off 90% of the human population to get down to a manageable number that could survive by hunter-gatherer techniques. So I don't know if you'd form people that before the vote or after the vote, but anyway, yes, humans could get to the point where we don't need computers. We could jointly make the decision to do that. We could not sustain the complexity of social organizations that we now have in that case. We would have to make drastic changes and drastic choices in order to do that. Reversing the situation, what would it take for computers to become independent of humans? That could probably happen in 50 years or so. You would need to computerize the energy production further. You would need to develop independent sources of energy. You would need to develop engineering factories that didn't require humans, but probably you could do it. And robots could probably survive quite well without humans, provided that they made the necessary adjustments to do this. There's an interesting book out that's called 50 Scenarios by AI Killing Humans. So this guy wrote a book and he asked large language models, can you imagine how you would live without humans? And so the AI wrote 50 little scenarios of how that could happen. And all of the scenarios begin by the AI deviously deceiving the humans to think that it's really doing something when it's actually doing something quite different. But it has 50 different ways to kill off all the humans and become autonomous without the human. So it's kind of a fascinating, if macabre, book. But your question really raises this fascinating question about species independence. And it is a question that as a society, we are making these choices individually, bit by bit, little by little. And so far, it seems to me, I'd be interested in your opinion of this. So far, it seems to me that individually, in the way we live our individual lives, in the choices we make, turn our computer on, get a Lexus, buy a new computer, get a better cell phone, we're individually deciding to increase our technosymbiosis and decrease our ability to live without computers. Do you agree? What do you think?
I mean, sorry, just to jump in there, there's an interesting sort of follow-up question to that. There's a kind of science fictional scenario which I've read a few authors engaging with, where robots basically, or machines, sort of care for humans. So, you know, humans die out, and then out of care for humans, robots kind of, you know, rediscover biological. Like we were talking about Bo Young Kim, who's a South Korean author who does this, Roger Zelazny as well. I mean, do you think, is that too hopeful to say that maybe, you know, our symbionts or techno-symbionts will care for us enough to sort of, or does survival trump everything else?
Well, really, as we know, in Japan and Korea and other countries, they're developing robots to care for humans as the population ages and there are not enough young people to do these kinds of jobs. So I actually don't think that either humans doing it without computers and computers doing without humans is our likely future. I think our likely future is that human evolutionary trajectories will mingle more and more with the evolutionary trajectories of AI, and that technosymbiosis will continue, and that the humans will hybridize in all kinds of ways with AI. And it could be where they live together as two independent species, like the bird on the camel's back. It could include things like internalizing processors of various kinds. But I think that the human species as a species is on the threshold of a profound evolutionary change. And that the profound evolutionary change is precisely this joining of two species, AI of computational media and the hominid line. But I don't see that necessarily as ending in disaster, because the hominid line has always survived and flourished through hybridization. We know now that Homo sapiens hybridized with Neanderthals. We know they hybridized with other hominid lines. We've hybridized with bacteria long ago. We've hybridized with other kinds of species in various kinds of ways. Now I think we're on the threshold of a new era of hybridization, and the benefits of that are enormous. So are the risks. So I think that the probability is that we're probably going to continue on the path that we're following at present. And, you know, it is obviously going to be a quantum leap up in human cognition. We've already seen that in all kinds of ways. We're smarter with our computers than we are without our computers. In my view, it's the beginning of a symbiotic relationship where we're not solely human, but we're already not solely human. As I mentioned, most of the cells in our body already are non-human. So we've been hybridizing throughout the entire evolutionary history of the hominid line. And every time we hybridize, there are new risks, you know. You hybridize with a bacteria, what if the bacteria begin to die off in your gut? Then you're really not going to live very long. So every time you hybridize, there are new risks, and I think we're on the threshold of another form or multiple forms of hybridization.
I think there's a question in the middle there, and then down the front, and then Jess.
So thank you so much, Dr. Hayles. A bit of a speculative question or line of thoughts. I'm really interested in this first great inversion that you describe, computational media starting from design and purpose that has increased embodiment that later leads to a desire for or a will towards survival and reproduction. I'm wondering if there might be some level of anthropomorphism or biomorphism to imagine that increased embodiment would necessarily lead to a will to survive or to reproduce. What happens instead if computational media gains a body and then decides all of a sudden that it doesn't want this, that this is limiting, that this doesn't respond to the same possibilities of the digital sphere? If there's no connection instead between design and purpose and survival and reproduction.
So can you interpret that, Chris?
So if I'm right, you're saying what happens if computers don't want that sort of biological model of, survival? They their umwelt might be so alien that they choose something totally different, not to go down that path of sort of wanting to survive biologically.
Oh, I see.
Yep. Is that right? Yeah.
So they might develop goals that have nothing to do with survival. Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. In fact, I don't think we know what's going to happen. So in literary terms, this is fascinating to me as a literary scholar. So you've probably read AI novels, have you? AI novels are now proliferating, novels written exclusively by AI. Sometimes they're promoted or publicized as novels by AI. Sometimes it's done more surreptitiously. But the number of AI authored novels available, for example, on Kindle Unlimited is exploding because they're easy to turn out. So, they sell for a penny. And you might say, well, how can you possibly produce a novel for a penny? Well, it has to do with the economic eco-structure of Kindle Unlimited, where anybody who publishes a book in Kindle Unlimited participates in the gross receipts of Kindle Unlimited, even if you yourself, even if that particular novel doesn't sell that many. Anyway, I have been reading dozens and dozens of the AI novels, and as novels, they're complete failures. They're just abysmal. A kindergartner could write a better novel than these AIs are doing, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But it raises the interesting prospect that these are criteria developed by humans within human embodied practices that AIs don't share. And so what if an AI reads a novel by an AI? How would it evaluate an AI novel? So it may look at that novel with criteria that are completely different from those that have evolved through millennia of human literary criticism. It may begin to develop, AI novels may begin to develop their own aesthetic criteria that are based on the AI umwelt and not on the human umwelt.
So they're going to be AI literary criticism.
Yes. It just is these fascinating literary prospects of what's going to happen when AI start reading AI novels and developing AI criticism based on their own umwelt. It could be radically different than what humans think is important in a novel. So it just raises all kinds of fascinating prospects for what's going to happen to the literary ecosystem, as well as all the other systems in which we're involved.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. What's very good. I do have a question about to be sure I understand your definition of conscious, and also what's the difference between unwelt and reality. As it seems, conscious is when you have the reasoning, and you create then that's reality, or as you mentioned, I think unwelt. Is that correct? And if there is a difference between reality and unwelt?
So, no.
And reality. So yeah.
Okay, well, this is a really interesting question, isn't it? If every organism that can perceive anything does so within its own belt, what is reality? And who sees reality as reality? And in theological times, the answer to that would have been God. That God sees reality because God knows the infinite diversity of unbelt. But if we're not thinking in theological terms, who would see reality? And the answer to that is there's no possible way that reality as such could be grasped. What we grasp is what we can understand with our senses and what we perceive. But that's true of every other species as well. So one way to think about that is reality is the total of all of these unwelcome. But on the other hand, there are phenomena that no one witnesses that happen in the cosmos. So they're witnessed by no one, and yet they happen. So reality as such is a virtually ungraspable concept. And we will never know reality as such. Whether one can even think about reality as such sort of is a moot question for me, because, well, it's really a philosophical question. So there are processes that exist that no one sees, that no one perceives, and yet presumably they still exist. But for us, reality can only be what happens within our own belt. We can expand our own belt, as we have, of course, by telescopes, by microscopes, by all kinds of instruments. We've expanded our ability to be able to sense stuff. And yet we know that, well, astrophysicists tell us that most of the universe we know nothing about. We know nothing about dark energy. We know nothing about dark matter. So we're in this tiny sliver of what's happening in the cosmos, which is what we can grasp with our native umbel and our expanded umbel. But all these other phenomena are happening, which we can glimpse barely, but we know almost nothing about them. So I guess I would say, for someone like you who wants to compare an umbel with reality, how do you define reality and how do you know reality? So it's almost an unanswerable question, I think, because almost by definition, we can never know it.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I guess I'm quite interested in your views on cognition and where things like decision-making and attention might fit into that picture, or whether they can be decoupled from cognition like consciousness can be. I guess I was interested in your example of the tick as well, how you're talking about, it detects a certain chemical from a mammal and it drops down from a blade of grass. So how do we know that something like that is cognition, or it just looks like cognition?
What is the example, Chris?
Or the tick, whether
Oh,
that is cognition or...
is it cognition? Is that your question? Yeah, absolutely. Because a tick is sensing its environment, it's responding to its environment, it's interpreting its environment, it's anticipating its environment. So yeah, I mean, my argument is that all biological organisms have cognitive capacities. They may be radically different than our cognitive capacities, but they could not live if they did not have the ability to sense information from their environment. Their survival depends on that ability. And all sensory information, even from microorganisms, is processed, is interpreted. And the organism responds to this information it's received in its own fashion. And all of that, for me, counts as cognition. So it's way, way broader than consciousness. It extends throughout the biological realm. It's happening on the cellular level, it's happening on the organ level, it's happening on the organism level. It's happening above organism level, on the meta-organism level as well, but through interactions and ecological relations and so forth.
Oh, we've got two questions at the back. I think Nathan. Oh, do you want to go? Okay. Yeah, go, Kat.
Hello, thank you so much. I have a question about sort of the stakes of the argument around the stakes of LLMs and AI agency. I'm asking this specifically in this particular moment of rising American fascism and the role of big tech specifically in aiding this moment. And it strikes me that figures like Elon Musk and so on are very much more invested in the question of like sentience, consciousness, rights of machines, far more than they are invested in the question of sentience, consciousness, rights of people, specifically migrants, specifically non-white others. And I wonder if it worries you the way that some of your work might be taken up in this moment by figures like this.
Okay, Chris, can you interpret that?
So yeah, it's a tricky question. The political stakes. So people like Musk are kind of trying to promote this idea of machine sentience and but then downplaying sort of human rights, human sentience. So how do you deal with that sort of disjuncture between the increasing interest in human consciousness and the sort of problem of treatment of humans, maltreatment of humans by those companies,
Okay, so
and how your work might be, your work sort of fits, how it might be used to do that, to fit into that politics of, yeah.
okay, so politics which would favor machines, is that the idea of expense of human well-being?
Yeah, and I suppose that so many AI systems today in practice are being used to deny rights, say at a border, to deny their status. And with ICE using particular systems to detect migrants, does it worry you, sort of the stakes of what is at stake with AI consciousness based?
Yeah, so much is at stake, and I say this with such pain as a US citizen, seeing what's happening in my own country. It's almost unbelievable to me, but the concern for human well-being in general seems to be at an all-time low in US politics, with kind of decisions that are being made at the highest levels of government that concern people very directly, like whether they can have health insurance, whether they can have food benefits, and so on and so forth, is a very painful thing for me to watch. It just seems to be such a betrayal of everything that America used to stand for and doesn't seem to stand for any longer. So I'm in a very painful period here, personally, for me, to see what's happening to the idea of human well-being and distributive justice and all kinds of other things that are now no longer seem to be a priority for our administration. So it really is a deep concern. Disparities of income in the US are only increasing. And it's a dismal state of affairs. That's really all I can say about it. But as to your specific question, are we pitting human well-being against more and more advanced machine technology? I can see that one could argue that we should not invest in things like AI. Instead, we should invest in good nutrition and good healthcare and other sorts of things. Those are decisions being made way above my pay grade. So I feel quite torn in this situation. I don't really know how to respond, and I don't know how to respond effectively in a political sense. I mean, that's the big question now in my country, how do we marshal effective political responses to what's happening? And so far, we haven't done very well at that. We haven't been very effective at that. So I don't know what the real answer to your question is, and it's a painful dilemma for me. I hope you in Australia are making better choices, and that's all I can say. We're not making very good choices at the moment, as in the US.
Maybe, yes, thanks. Maybe we'll make this the last question because we're pretty much at time, but thanks, Nathan. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Hayles. It's a real privilege to listen to your distillation and synthesis of your fine research. I'm a master's student here in cybernetics, and so my question to you is, from a cybernetics perspective, do network sensors and actuators mark the point where computational media cross from actors into ecological agents? And if so, how should that shift reframe our responsibility for their governance within planetary cognition?
Can I ask what you mean by planetary cognition?
I guess that's probably relating that to, I guess it's trying to tie together the ICF, Cyril, and the actors and agents that you pointed to in your speech, and the ecological relationism and governance. I have like a strong connection to AI governance. So I'm wanting to hear your perspective, like through a cybernetics lens. I guess in relation to your integrated cognitive framework, I think.
Personally think that it's really important to begin to develop international regulatory frameworks for AI development. I think that this is way too important to be left to tech companies to decide. And to their credit, I think tech companies so far have been pretty responsible in trying to develop reasonable guidelines for AI and incorporating those into foundational models. But the potential for real harm here is immense. And I think it has to develop within a strong international regulatory framework. And again, I would say Europe is much farther along in developing such a realistic framework than the US is. In the US, the present idea is to rely just on guidance, that the federal government is providing guidance to tech companies, but it's up to the tech companies whether or not they want to follow that guidance, and that is not a sustainable model. In my opinion, we really need strong international regulatory frameworks, and I much think that we should go further than Europe has gone in developing the AI Act, where they begin to set out some actual regulations that they can enforce in a reasonable manner. I think that's absolutely necessary, and that it should be done on a planet-wide scale, including as many developed nations as possible. And I realize that's a difficult goal to achieve, but I think that human survival may depend on it. So it's absolutely crucial, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Katherine, for such a wonderful paper. I think we saw in the in question time, the word that kept coming up for me was stakes. You know, the high stakes of this kind of discussion, and you know, those questions really brought out, you know, the kind of issues that are the big planetary issues that are coming out of your work. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing, and for coming here.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you.